one of the things that I love about AI development and using these models is kind of taking more of an experimentation approach, sort of the mindset of a data scientist, where you're starting with a hypothesis, you sort of assess those three criteria that I outlined, you're making a determination on what model might be best, and then going through some experimentation first to make a determination as to whether it's right for the type of data you're using, right for the cost that you need, right for the responsiveness, and as I noted, the traceability and stuff. And that way you can adjust and flex accordingly before it's really in production.
Welcome to the Information Week Podcast. I'm Senior Editor Xiao-Pierre Ruth, your host. Today's episode, we are going to take a look at RAG versus long context in terms of AI frameworks. Which paths do you choose to cut down on data noise and really sort things out? For today's episode, we are joined by Robin Gordon, who's the Chief Data Officer for Hippo Insurance. Robin, good to be seeing you.
Nice to see you.
And we're also joined by Gabe Goodhart, Chief Architect, AI Innovation for IBM. Gabe, good to be seeing you as well.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. All right. So, RAG versus long context. For both of you, can you please just start by talking about what is the first determination that you make when deciding on which framework model you're going to go with? Where do you start? What makes sense?
So for me, I always start with the use case first and think about the model and the framework second. There are lots and lots of different problems you can solve with AI. Some of them are broad, some of them are narrow, some of them are fault tolerant, some of them are not. And the analysis of the problem is a key guiding factor in deciding what model to use, what framework to use, whether to use various flavors of context management, RAG, et cetera, all the different RAG patterns. So there are lots of different options to choose from in the architecture, and the problem you're trying to solve is the key guide to which to choose.
Yeah, I think I have a pretty similar answer. Certainly don't start with the model. That's probably rule number one. And I kind of look at it from the business decision standpoint. What are we trying to improve? Because once we have clarity on that, then the model question tends to just flow naturally. When you start with the model, then you start to try and force fit the business problem into the technical solution. So I kind of take three practical lenses in assessing how to go about the problem solving. First, what's the job to get done? What questions are we answering, or are we supporting a decision? What are we automating? How are we going to take action on those things? Because each one of those answers is going to result in a different type of reasoning and control factors and stuff that need to be considered. The second thing I consider is what level of trust is required. Do I need to have very traceable, explicit information that I'm making decisions on? Or is this something like a summarization where it's going to inform me, but it's not necessarily going to need to be fully traceable and observable? And then the third is, what does the data look like? Am I dealing with structured data, unstructured data, internal, external, real-time, historical? All of that factors into what type of technical solution I might use.
That was some great 3 points. And just to add one thing that I would consider from the architecture side is to always design for model flexibility, because even if you choose the best model today, chances are pretty good tomorrow it's going to be a different model that fits your cost to quality ratio. So I love your framing, Robin. That's really cool, those three pillars.
Thinking about the idea of the cost content ratio, how do you address if and when there's a mismatch that comes up with the organization and what you've kind of put together? What do you like? What are you checking? Where are you going in terms of sorting that out?
Well, I really think that. Sorry, go ahead. I'll jump in if you. I think this is kind of one of the more common failure modes that I've seen, and it kind of shows up in two ways. Either you're over-engineering your solution, or you're under engineering your solution. So you either have something that's way too complicated for the problem statement, or something that's too simplistic. And so, one of the things that I love about AI development and using these models is kind of taking more of an experimentation approach, sort of the mindset of a data scientist, where you're starting with a hypothesis, you sort of assess those three criteria that I outlined, you're making a determination on what model might be best, and then going through some experimentation first to make a determination as to whether it's right for the type of data you're using, right for the cost that you need, right for the responsiveness, and as I noted, the traceability and stuff. And that way you can adjust and flex accordingly before it's really in production. So you don't take kind of that standard software engineering approach of like, scope it, build it, deploy it. This is more of an iterative approach. And I think that really helps to avoid the mismatching problems.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. And the way I frame it is that there's basically two aspects. And I think this aligns a lot with your sort of over engineering versus under engineering dichotomy. For me, it's what is the solution architecture? So, and then what is the user expecting for the user experience out of this situation, right? So there are some problems that fundamentally a synchronous chatbot is not the right experience for. If it requires a much larger quantity of data, you're going to need a longer time horizon. And if somebody's sitting there waiting on a spinny wheel in a chat box, that's going to be a bad UX, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're not solving the problem well. You're just not presenting it to the user correctly. So that's one lever you can adjust if you have a mismatch in your quality to expectations ratio there. You can make it more of an asynchronous reporting type task, or a data collection with a report at the end, or some kind of feedback that comes back asynchronously. But I think in many ways, the more important leverage that a lot of people miss is just understanding that the solution architecture is much bigger than a model. I think a lot of people think about it's a model and it's data, and that's the whole story. And frankly, it really, really isn't. And so there's a whole lot that goes into building an AI solution to a problem. Like I said, some problems are broad, some are narrow, some are fault tolerant, some are not. And so when you're selecting a flavor of RAG or an architecture for RAG, there are some really critical decisions you have to make, but they can be adjusted relatively independently from one another. So one of the biggest ones is your data ingest, right? This is one of the places where quality drops without you could do this without any actual change to how you run this thing at inference time. So getting better data extraction out of your data is critical. We focus a lot of this at IBM. We have many years of experience in the data world, and it really makes a big difference in getting better quality out of smaller models and simpler systems. So being able to extract that data well, retain things like charts, tables, scientific formulas, layouts and columns, embedded imagery, all of that stuff, especially if you're coming out of business documents, is really critical data that's very easy to lose with a naive ingestion solution. Beyond that, how you actually do the retrieval is really critical. So you can do naive RAG retrieval, where you're simply using some kind of a semantic embedding space. And even that has many levers you can pull around. How do you chunk your documents? What embedding model are you using? What was that embedding model trained for? But you can also go much further than that. You can apply a graph RAG analysis, where you actually create a knowledge graph out of your data, and that you can combine that with a semantic index. And how and when you choose to retrieve can also change a lot as you go. So you can always statically retrieve the 10 best documents. You can do something more dynamic, where you have an iterative process, more of an agentic loop, where the loop determines, do I have enough context to answer this question? No, go get some more context. You can change your chunking strategy at ingest time to get bigger chunks or smaller chunks, depending on how context grounded you need the actual results to be. So there are many different levers just even within RAG to choose. And I think those are different pieces that people often don't dive deep enough to look at. How do you adjust for again, going back to the problem you're trying to solve. If the data that needs to be presented to actually solve the problem is deep, that changes how you do your RAG architecture. If it's shallow and wide, that also changes your RAG architecture.
Yeah, I like that explanation. I was kind of thinking about an example, maybe in the insurance space, that would help to bring that to life a little bit. So, trying to take an explanation of coverage to a customer after a claim. So there's facts that have to flow into the conversation, things about the policy, the deductible, what's covered, what's excluded, like all of that's really critical to get absolutely right. It's a lot of structured data. There's going to be some unstructured data, and you can't have improvisation on that information. But turning around and then communicating all of that information to a customer who's stressed out because something's just happened to their home and they need to get it fixed and stuff is something that has to be addressed in a slightly different way, right? Like the interpretation and contextualization and how to communicate that effectively, I think is a different way of thinking about what model to use and how to bring your data together in a way that allows for that contextualization. So the system becomes retrieval for truth, model for interpretation, RAG can pull the exact policy clauses, the LLM can translate it into something that the customer can actually understand and act on. So neither RAG nor contextual does the full job, but together I think they make for a perfect combination to provide that experience and the accuracy needed.
Actually, it leads actually directly into the next question, whether or not we might be moving into there's some talks, at least some spaces, talking about the possibility of contextual, kind of eclipsing RAG and at least certain mindsets. It sounds like you've already kind of said, like, there's more harmony there. Can you elaborate a little bit more and even talk about, like, pros and cons that you see with using these different kinds of frameworks?
So for me, I think the RAG versus long context dichotomy is very much a false dichotomy. I think they're extremely complementary. And again, to keep beating the drum, it comes back to your use case and your data. If your data is wildly diverse and it's more of a needle in a haystack type of thing, think a customer Q&A type bot, RAG could still be far stronger in terms of its responsiveness because you are not asking the model to work its way through lots of irrelevant data to find the right answer. Whereas if it's much more of a synthesis problem, you might choose to do larger chunks in RAG and consume more of that long context. But long context always comes with the latency delta on time to first token. So you just have to ask the math to math more to deal with long context. So even if you might hypothetically get better grounding of your response by shoving more information in, you are making a user experience trade-off. Now that can be mitigated by choosing a smaller model potentially, but now you're potentially sort of making an intelligence versus context trade-off. And so that has to be experimented. Back to the first question, staying model flexible, staying architecture flexible. If these are knobs you can tune, you can really dial it in to get the right user experience and quality out. So I think they're extremely complementary. And I think certainly you can use extremely long context frontier models that are deployed on extremely expensive optimized hardware that is not going to hit your quality to cost ratio. It might hit your quality threshold, but that fundamentally at a cost standpoint is going to be more expensive than trying to get this right with smaller models and a more well-curated system.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's not so much long context versus RAG. It's more about what is the problem you're trying to solve and what are the criteria in solving that are super important. So time, quality of data and stuff. So the more useful frame, I think, is that every case has a best fit architecture. And in many of those sort of applications could actually use multiple solutions, not just one versus the other. And I think we're going to see, sort of an evolution of that too, beyond just those two options. I think where we're heading is, like that combined view of things, using retrieval to narrow down the universe of relevant material, but then using a long context model to reason deeply over that curated set feels to me like a really good way of thinking about both of them as complementary tools, not opposing tools.
And this is actually, a topic I've been thinking a lot about lately too, is that, these are two methods of managing the context for your LLM. Document ingestion, we typically call that knowledge. RAG is sort of a way of implementing knowledge. And then, just pure long context knowledge versus chunkwise knowledge. Those are two different flavors of knowledge, but knowledge is not by any means the only method for context management. So you can have many other ways of curating the context that you're actually using to solve the problem. So an agentic loop that is going out and performing sub-agents to do background research to curate the sections of content is another technique that a lot of solutions are using right now. So there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice that context. Obviously, tool calling is a big one in the agentic loop. These are all different flavors of how do you literally get those tokens that are going to add up to a big, long sequence, and what should that sequence look like when you're finally trying to produce the final result. So you can do a lot of things that are clever and not linear in that token sequence. You can go off to the side and do a little sub-agent loop that produces, burns a bunch of tokens, and comes back with a nice pithy response to one specific component, and that becomes a chunk of your context for the final solution. So there's lots of different ways to slice and dice this. It's a rich ecosystem.
Yeah, I think when we think about these situations, examples are always super helpful. So in the insurance industry, we have the regulatory environment. We have a lot of things that we have to get precisely right. But at the same time, we've got a lot of varied data, lots of very long documents. If a claim is taking months and months, it could be lots of adjuster information, legal correspondence, notes created and stuff. So that's where, the long context actually becomes super helpful, because there's no way we're going to be able to ingest all of that information and interpret it appropriately. RAG wouldn't be appropriate for that, with the chunking and stuff. So having the long context and being able to bring all of that documentation together so that we have the interpretation and can act on it appropriately, I think is a really huge benefit to long context, but it wouldn't serve every purpose in terms of just being able to meet some of the strict guidelines that we have to follow in managing claims and handling our customers.
Yeah, another concrete example that I come from in the development world is the development agents that everybody's building today. A lot of the context is curated by tool calling and the agentic loop, but especially if you're working in any kind of a specialized system or even just a programming language that has a standard library, those docs, that documentation on how to use the system that's available, is a flavor that could easily be addressed with RAG. So many of the assistants today come with prepackaged RAG indexes for well-known libraries or well-known solutions, and then you also then dynamically curate your long context with the agent by looking at the code in the code base. So it can very much harmonize here. And you need that long context innovation in the model space because, models are hungry for context, right? We know that. But how you curate that context can be a very rich ecosystem of multiple different techniques that come together.
Awesome. Listen, I appreciate all your thoughts on those questions. And it is now time, as I'm raising my Ninja Turtles game screen, and for those who are listening rather than watching along, now it is time for questionable ideas, our tabletop exercise where our panel of esteemed guests will serve as interim executives at our fictional company called Questionable Ideas. These scenarios were not shared in advance with our guests, and they are intentionally over the top, but relate to today's topic. My guests are not responsible for the presence of goblins, kobolds, or gremlins in these scenarios. That is entirely my fault. So once again, Gabe, Robin, you will be serving as interim executives for Questionable Ideas with the same authority and powers that you assume in your current roles. The goblins, for context, the goblins represent the more fast-moving, let's just do this because it looks new and shiny kind of perspective. The kobolds tend to be more traditional or very old school thinking, or very, very stoic in their approach. And the gremlins represent just chaos. And feel free to take whatever action you deem necessary for what you are presented. Okay. Robin, Gabe, are you ready?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. First scenario. Questionable Ideas wants new AI resources in-house and customer-facing for their customer-facing needs. The CEO has been convinced by the resident goblins that using a RAG framework for everything will allow for the most up-to-date results. So they went ahead and paid for access to a multitude of vector databases, including many that have not been vetted for accuracy or ethics. Also, Questionable Ideas has not yet trained the staff on prompt engineering. Most people are just winging it, which the goblins say should be fine. The results are questionable, and no one knows how much this is actually costing the companies as the goblins keep adding more databases. The CEO is happy that there is at least some new AI being used, but the CFO, quite notably, has not chimed in about the costs. In fact, they seem to be missing from the conversation and the office entirely. How would you rein in this project? Who would you include in the planning? And do you call search and rescue to find the CFO? Because the goblins are looking very suspicious about their absence.
Well, I think the first thing to do is to understand the state of the problem and to essentially put a pause on the goblins' overeager, spend all the money as fast as we can mentality. We need to understand what they're spending it on, and then understand which of the solutions they're currently paying for pass our company's thresholds for quality, vetting, and actually being worth the spend. And frankly, in a RAG solution, more is not always better. In fact, more can be confusing. The real value here is going to come out of doing it correctly, getting the data into the index correctly, retrieving it in a valuable way that matches the problem we're trying to solve. So slowing down from the all of the above approach and aiming at one problem at a time that we can fix and one solution that we can actually optimize for will get us a much longer sustainable path over the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd probably call in the CFO because something's amiss there, that he's AWOL, and make sure that he's sort of managing the FinOps aspect of this. And then, just given my role and my lens of being data oriented, I'd probably want to just dig into what data is really needed, and why are we propagating all these databases if they're not necessarily going to solve the problem? Because we don't need tons and tons and tons of data. We need the right data in the right quantity.
Well, regarding the CFO's whereabouts, you do visit the office, and there's a small note scrawled with crayon that says "out to lunge," that looks like it is definitely written by the goblins. So the CFO is out missing, and you have not called search and rescue. So, oh no, we're going to have to get a new CFO because who knows what the goblins did with them. Okay, on to the second scenario. Questionable Ideas has rethought the AI plan, is now considering a long context framework that the kobolds have put forth. They call it the Overmind Language Terminal, OMLET for short, which they intend to run entirely with company-owned resources. This will require building out a campus just dedicated to computational resources, which will raise some issues in terms of power, buying data storage, GPUs, etc. The kobolds promise that this one-time cost, though huge, will cover everything the company will ever need, at least as far as they're concerned. But in practice, the omelet has raised red flags about data leakage, some questions about omelet understanding the nuances, understanding nuance and missing context as well. The kobolds recommend ignoring those issues and dismissing anyone who questions the omelet. Can a long context framework become a one-size-fits-all solution in the future?
Yeah, I think we've both covered it earlier, but no. And if that is even a valid hypothesis, we need a proof that is not at the scale of building out an in-house data center. So if the kobolds are convinced that a long context framework is the right way, show me the proof in a local non-latency optimized implementation that runs on your laptop or some small server that you purchase for under $10,000, right? So I think design it and build it, or at the very least, prototype it. That's one of the joys of the current AI age we live in. You can prototype these things before you have actually spent the company piggy bank to actually build out the data center. So absolutely, we do not go full scale data center first. We go, does this work? But again, to the scope of the data, if our data is too big to fit even in the longest context models, this is fundamentally not going to work, and we need a hybrid solution.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think it goes back to some of what I was talking about with regard to experimentation and just allowing for that iterative approach to learn and develop the right hypothesis. Absolutely. I think we also have to be careful in this scenario that we don't commit to a single architecture and embed all of our financials into that, because we know for a fact that in days, weeks, months, there's going to be changes in the models available to us. And so committing to something this enormous for one particular type of model, I think is foolhardy for sure.
Great. Well, speaking of a hybrid approach, on to our final scenario. Thank you for the input on the second one. Okay. Questionable Ideas has come around to the idea of exploring a more hybrid approach to its AI frameworks. You're planning to sit down with stakeholders to try and match operational needs with resources and the frameworks. As everyone gathers, the gremlins walk into the room, and everyone's devices, laptops, phones, tablets, go dark as if an EMP went off. But then they slowly reboot. The gremlins explain that they have taken over the project, and a new system called Scrambled Eggs has been put in place to replace Omelet. No one will know if they're dealing with RAG or long context when they use Scrambled Eggs, because Scrambled Eggs will switch to different frameworks mid-prompt. At least that's what they're planning. Everyone will simply have to adapt to these results and the way the machine spirits have intended them to use it. The gremlins say that this will be a learning experience for the organization. Which should come first? The operational and human understanding of the technology, or the AI benefits that the users might not realize yet?
Well, first thing, I'm pretty sure that the gremlins need to have their laptops taken away and their internet access cut off, right? If they are doing something to hijack company computers, that is an insider threat that should be immediately addressed. Second of all, again, Robin, I love your point. Experimentation is key here. This could hypothetically be a great architecture, but enforcing it at a company takeover level is absolutely not the right approach. Building a tool that is accessible and built with the right safeguards in mind, that you let a few key decision makers at your business experiment with, is a great idea. Opt in, don't force it down anybody's throat. And once it's proven to have its value, then you can think about a phased rollout where you actually expose it. I think the idea of hiding the implementation details is not a bad one. I think fundamentally, AI systems should be designed to solve the problems that users have, and whether they are using one framework for context management or another is immaterial to the people actually using the systems. But I think, again, how this is rolled out, how this is adopted needs to be done in a sandboxed, safe opt-in way, and obviously not a company takeover way.
Yeah, so we might be calling the police in this
Finally.
scenario.
Yep.
And once
Agreed.
the gremlins are put in handcuffs and escorted away, I think we have to recognize that this is a really incredibly powerful tool, but also an incredibly misunderstood tool. And so a lot of what we have to tackle in getting people to be better equipped to use these tools in a responsible, meaningful, productive way is to help them better understand these tools and what's available to them. Because the output is just so convincing in any scenario that it's really easy to kind of take for granted what's being spit out. And so making sure that we've got informed users, that they're questioning the tools, that they're not taking for granted the output stuff, I think is a super important aspect to this scenario that we're talking about here. Because had the gremlins been able to take over and just execute the way they had, we could have seen really wild outcomes that would be completely inaccurate and cause all sorts of chaos in the company. But if we'd had well-informed users that questioned and pushed back and maybe used their own intellect in assessing that these things were not right, but also having an appreciation for where things can go terribly wrong, I think would have been a good buffer to the potential that the gremlins got away with their bad behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Fundamentally, it comes down to trust, and that's a two-sided coin, right? You need the educated users, and you need the system that is designed to establish that trust. So back to some of the earlier conversations we had about different RAG frameworks, you can design a RAG framework that actually builds that trust in its user output. So it can generate citations. It can actually produce a meta-analysis of its output relative to the grounded retrieval content, and actually gives it a groundedness score or a hallucination score. You can even have a meta loop in there that says, is this question even answerable from the context I have available? And so all of those different things can build trust in the system output. So, well, this idea of a hybrid sort of many different approaches implementation is potentially a good one. It needs to be designed towards that trust that then gets combined with the user education to understand, how do you evaluate the output that you're getting? You ultimately are the arbiter of utility out of the system, you the user. And so you have to have that critical eye. And if the system can present things that help you with that critical eye, like citations, that can build that trust much more quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree.
Well, Gremlins were not really built on the idea of trust. They figured they'd ask for forgiveness from prison, but they do note that they were not responsible for the missing CFO. That's entirely the Goblin's fault.
Did we ever find him?
Well, you didn't call search and rescue when you had the chance. So.
Oh, damn it.
We needed a better tool description in our context. Okay. You did give us that hint.
Okay, well, listen, Robin, Gabe, you've been fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast today. Thank you for your insight and trying to navigate the nonsense of questionable ideas. Thank you so much for your wisdom today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This is fun.
Thank you. This was great.